Usually when we talk about like vast national wealth and security, there's this underlying expectation of permanence.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it feels like a fortress, right?
Well,
Like the assumption is just like, well, if a country builds its economic walls high enough and, pads the state bank accounts deep enough, the chaotic world outside simply stops mattering.
right, yeah, that illusion of insulation is really
Yeah.
powerful. I mean, prosperity often creates this uh, psychological shield. We start
Yeah.
to believe that just having enough resources makes a society fundamentally immune to, the kind of raw existential instability that affects the rest of the world.
Exactly. But then you step into a scenario where the very foundation of that fortress is suddenly under direct literal fire.
Right.
Overnight, all that insulation is just stripped away. And we are looking at a behavioral landscape right now that is actively being rewired by a massive external shock.
It's fascinating because it acts as the ultimate real-time stress test of a society's psychological endurance.
Yeah.
It forces us to see what happens when the safety net just entirely vanishes.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. So welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Our mission today for you listening is to unpack a truly fascinating 2026 paper by Mohammed Buheji.
Yeah, it's a great one.
It really is. It's titled Behavioral Change Opportunities of GCC Citizens During Iran War.
And, just to be incredibly clear right up front for you listening, this source material deals with a highly charged ongoing geopolitical scenario, right? The 2026 U.S.-Israeli-Iran war.
Right. Very heavy topic.
Very heavy. And we are maintaining absolute neutrality here. Our goal isn't to endorse any political or geopolitical viewpoints contained in the paper, but strictly to unpack the fascinating behavioral science and social psychology that the author is proposing.
Exactly. We are looking strictly at the behavioral mechanics here. We're tracking how the intense pressure of this conflict is acting as a catalyst, basically forcing a complete rewiring of social and economic behavior among citizens in the Gulf Cooperation Council, or, the GCC countries.
Right.
We really want to understand how a society makes the incredibly difficult shift from, like, passive entitlement to active contribution when faced with an extreme threat. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because we all know war is inherently destructive.
It's terrifying, yeah.
Right, it's terrifying. But the research here reveals a surprising aha moment. Severe crisis can actually function as an engine for positive social evolution.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive at first.
It totally does. But to grasp that, though, we really need to understand the socioeconomic starting line of the GCC states before these conflict sirens started going off.
Right, and that starting line is rooted in what political economists call the rentier state legacy.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So to give some context, this is a framework first articulated back in the 1970s by scholars like Mahdavi, and then later expanded by Biblawi and Luciani. Historically, the social contract in these Gulf states was built entirely on the distribution of massive external rents.
So basically the profits from exporting oil and gas?
Exactly. In a classic rentier bargain, the state doesn't rely on taxing its citizens to function, like at all. Instead, the state acts as this massive distributor of wealth.
Meaning the citizens receive huge state-provided benefits. We're talking heavy subsidies on utilities, housing grants, free education, healthcare, and virtually guaranteed, highly paid employment within the public sector.
Right.
The paper actually explicitly refers to this dynamic as a modern system built on bread and circuses.
Which is a heavy term, but it describes how that distribution creates a very specific psychological dynamic.
Yeah.
I mean, in exchange for this literal cradle-to-grave financial security, the citizens offer political quiescence.
They just don't rock the boat.
Exactly. They accept the absolute authority of the ruling structure without demanding the kind of political representation you'd normally see in tax-based democracies.
Right, because they aren't footing the bill.
Precisely. And over decades, this cultivates a distinct cognitive framework regarding work, risk, and civic duty. The researchers characterize it as a rentier mentality, or passive spoil behavior.
Which, to be clear, the paper emphasizes is not a moral failing of the individuals.
No, not at all. It is the deliberate, institutionalized product of generations of state-citizen relations where the state basically absorbs all the risk.
And that creates a very specific demographic vulnerability. The paper highlights that GCC citizens are actually minorities in their own countries.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering.
They really are. We're talking about citizens making up roughly 11% of the population in the UAE, 33% in Saudi Arabia, and 40% in Kuwait.
Wow.
Yeah, so they rely completely on a massive imported expatriate workforce to keep the entire physical and economic infrastructure running.
Right, so picture this. You have a minority population heavily insulated by state wealth, almost entirely reliant on foreign labor for essential services, and then the 2026 conflict shatters that illusion of untouchable stability.
Suddenly there are drone strikes hitting civilian infrastructure, ports, vital oil refineries.
The Gulf is no longer this insulated haven, right? The physical danger is immediate.
Plus, the economic threat alone is just staggering. I mean, the paper notes that if the Strait of Hormuz is subjected to sustained closure,
Which is a massive artery for global energy.
huge. If it closes, regional GDPs could plummet by 10 to 15% in just 3 months. That is an absolute existential crisis for the rentier bargain.
Yeah, because if the state loses its revenue, it literally can't pay for the bread and circuses.
Exactly. It's essentially like a trust fund kid who has, never had to worry about rent, suddenly discovering the family business is under hostile attack, the accounts are frozen, and they have to step up to save the enterprise.
That's a great way to put it.
I would imagine a population so deeply conditioned to total security must experience a profound cognitive dissonance when processing that sudden vulnerability.
Oh, definitely. And processing that vulnerability requires us to look at human neurobiology under extreme stress.
Okay, let's get into the brain science.
So, Kahneman and Tversky's foundational prospect theory is essential here. A core tenet of their work is loss aversion. Basically, the psychological reality that humans feel the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Right, so losing $100 stings twice as much as finding $100 feels good.
Exactly. The brain treats loss as an active physical threat.
So scaling that up to the threat of war.
It triggers massive loss aversion. And regret aversion, too. In socioeconomic market, this manifests as a complete behavioral freeze.
A freeze.
Yeah, and we have neuroeconomic evidence detailing exactly how this happens. The paper cites a fascinating 2025 study by Marg Malecki on the previous Iran-Israel war, which actually mapped brain chemistry under prolonged geopolitical stress.
Oh, wow. What did they find?
The findings showed that extreme stress fundamentally alters neural activity in the prefrontal cortex and the striatum.
Right, and just as a refresher for anyone listening, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for complex, long-term planning and impulse control.
While the striatum handles our immediate reward processing and survival instincts.
Okay, so what happens when the sirens go off?
The stress of war literally pulls blood flow and resources away from the prefrontal cortex. The brain basically decides that long-term deliberative choices, like, a 10-year investment portfolio, are completely irrelevant when survival is threatened.
Which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Totally. It forces the individual into habitual, survival-based reactions. In Mark Malecki's study, this neurological shift led to extreme stress-led saving. People locked down their capital, they stopped starting businesses, stopped investing, because their brains were desperately trying to exert control over a terrifyingly unpredictable environment.
Okay, wait. I need to push back on that mechanic, though.
Sure.
Because if the brain is forcing people to obsessively lock down their money and save because they're terrified of the future, how do we explain panic buying? Because we always see grocery store shelves wiped out during a crisis. If panic buying is an individual survival instinct, it seems like wild spending. Locking down your savings and panic buying are completely opposite behaviors.
You would think so, yeah.
It seems like the brain must separate abstract financial security from immediate physical scarcity.
And that is the exact paradox of the brain under threat. You hit the nail on the head. The brain does separate those two types of security.
Really?
Yeah. People freeze their long-term abstract financial investments to hoard capital, but simultaneously, they will aggressively liquidate other assets to overstock immediate tangible essentials. The striatum demands immediate physical security.
Give me the toilet paper, give me the bottled water.
Exactly. And in the GCC, this biological reflex is highly critical because some of these states rely on the Strait of Hormuz for up to 90% of their food imports.
90%. Wow. So the biological instinct to hoard creates artificial shortages.
Right.
Even if there is technically enough food in the supply chain, the sheer velocity of panic buying empties the shelves, spikes prices, and actually accelerates the exact economic damage they are trying to avoid.
Yes. The individual survival instinct becomes profoundly self-destructive when you multiply it across a whole population.
Okay, but if the individual biological instinct is to hoard and panic, humans must have developed a countermeasure, right? To
Yeah.
prevent societies from just collapsing every time there's a crisis.
Thankfully, yes.
There has to be a psychological mechanism that overrides that striatum-driven panic and forces people to care more about the stability of the group than, hoarding cans of beans in their own pantry.
There is. The community immune system against that panic is social identity.
Social identity.
Yeah. Social identity theory, which was developed by Tajfel and Turner, posits that human beings derive a massive portion of their self-concept from the groups they belong to. And for GCC citizens, this identity architecture is deeply multi-layered. You have the national identity, being strictly Qatari or Emirati or Saudi. Above that, you have the Khaliji or Gulf identity, which is the supranational cultural bond. And then beyond that, you have the broader Arab or Islamic identity.
Okay, and the research has some deeply counterintuitive findings about which of those layers actually functions as psychological armor, right?
It really does. The paper analyzes a 2021 study by Amin and colleagues. They studied Qatari youth during the 2017 blockade.
Which, just for context, was a period when Qatar was essentially cut off economically and physically by its own Gulf neighbors.
Exactly. So you would logically assume that when a nation is under direct threat from its neighbors, the local national identity would harden.
Right, like the assumption is that Qataris would double down strictly on being Qatari to defend against the threat. Us versus them.
Exactly. But the study revealed the opposite. Yeah. The Khaliji identity, meaning identifying with the broader Gulf region, which included the very citizens of the countries blockading them, was actually the strongest predictor of psychological well-being and resilience.
Oh, wow. That feels like realizing your bitter, lifelong sibling rivalry totally vanishes the second an outsider attacks your sibling.
That's a perfect analogy.
Like, even when the siblings are fighting each other, recognizing that you are still part of the same larger family provides a strange kind of comfort.
Yes. Identifying with the broader region buffered citizens against the psychological damage of the threat because it prevented the complete othering of the adversary.
It kept them human.
Right. It maintained a common in-group. Because the historical roots of this Khaliji identity go back centuries to Bedouin tribal networks, a shared pearling economy, deep intermarriage across borders long before modern nation-states even existed.
That makes a lot of sense.
So the paper suggests that during the intense pressure of the 2026 war, authorities need to aggressively leverage this supranational bond. Highlighting shared Gulf heritage and common dialects provides a psychological anchor that prevents citizens from feeling entirely isolated.
But having that identity available organically is one thing, right? Getting millions of stressed out people to actively lean into it instead of panicking requires a catalyst. Policymakers have to actively engineer the situation using behavioral economics.
They do, and they rely heavily on nudge theory.
Pioneered by Feller and Sunstein, right?
You got it. The core concept is that instead of fighting human nature, like, say, trying to legislate away loss aversion, authorities should use it constructively.
Use the glitch as a feature.
Exactly. You frame the choices so that the brain's natural instincts effortlessly lead to positive social outcomes.
Okay, so instead of a government abstractly telling the public, let's work together to grow our national economy, which frankly feels incredibly distant when drones are flying overhead.
It doesn't register.
Right, so you use loss framing. You broadcast, let's work together right now to prevent losing $5 billion from our shared economy.
Exactly. The brain reacts much more urgently to preventing that tangible loss. And the paper outlines very targeted physical nudges to deploy this. To stop the hoarding we discussed earlier, authorities shouldn't just issue press releases telling people not to panic.
That never works anyway.
Never. They need to use visible reserve displays. Broadcasting footage of massive, fully stocked state warehouses directly addresses that biological fear of scarcity. Seeing the physical evidence visually turns off the brain's scarcity alarm in a way words never could.
They also utilize social norm messaging, right? Like sending out targeted alerts saying 95% of your neighbors are buying only what they need.
Right. It triggers our herd mentality, but channels it toward restraint instead of panic.
That's incredibly smart. They also deploy unified bilingual emergency alerts, like what the UAE has developed, to immediately cut through the noise of social media rumors and provide authoritative, calming instructions.
But government mandates alone are insufficient and can actually breed resentment.
True.
The paper heavily emphasizes the vital role of civil society functioning as trusted intermediaries. A government ad campaign demanding sacrifice might be viewed with suspicion, right?
Sure.
But a local mosque framing patience and reduced consumption as a fundamental Islamic virtue carries immense organic moral authority.
Oh, absolutely. And majalis, the traditional tribal councils, they can activate long-standing honor codes to mobilize extended family networks to look after vulnerable neighbors, totally bypassing the need for state intervention.
Exactly. And women's associations are uniquely positioned to manage household consumption norms and teach strategic, sustainable stockpiling instead of frantic panic buying.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, and I have to raise a red flag that the paper itself warns about.
Let's hear it.
Isn't this kind of social engineering inherently Orwellian? I mean, we are talking about highly surveyed populations. If citizens realize they're being psychologically steered, nudged, and tracked rather than genuinely supported, wouldn't that trust deficit just backfire into massive social resistance?
It's a great point. And the author acknowledges that trust deficit is a very real danger. The nudging must be rooted in what Thaler and Sunstein call libertarian paternalism.
Libertarian paternalism.
Yeah, it has to be highly transparent and culturally organic. It cannot be about a state forcing a brand new personality onto the public at gunpoint.
Right, you can't fake it.
No, it is about creating visible, frictionless opportunities for voluntary civic engagement. If a government attempts to aggressively dismantle the rentier social contract overnight and just demands heavy sacrifice without fostering profound trust, the population will simply retreat back into survival mode and social fragmentation.
So it's about architecture, not coercion.
Beautifully put.
If authorities build a platform for citizens to help and frame it using their existing cultural values, the citizens will step up. Which I guess logically brings us to what this looks like when it succeeds. If these nudges work, how does a rentier state citizen actually transform on the ground?
Well, the ultimate goal is reframing citizenship itself, shifting the definition from passive consumption to active contribution.
Right.
And the paper documents incredible positive behaviors emerging under this wartime crucible. One of the most fascinating is performative calm.
Performative calm, meaning citizens are consciously modeling calm behavior in grocery stores or public squares because they recognize that emotional contagion spreads panic.
Exactly.
By acting calm, they are performing a vital public service. They serve as a firebreak against mass hysteria.
We also see profound cross-sectarian solidarity.
Yeah.
Sunni and Shia communities, which might have historically experienced friction, deliberately supporting each other.
Because the shared existential threat supersedes sectarian lines.
Right. They recognize that internal divisions would only be exploited by the enemy. There is even a revival of home-based food production and traditional self-sufficiency skills that had literally been abandoned for decades.
And there is a massive shift in the dynamic with the expatriate majority too, isn't there?
A huge shift.
Because before the crisis, there was often tension. Locals feeling expats were taking lucrative private sector jobs, and expats feeling locals were entitled. But the wartime nudge reframes this entirely into complementary roles.
Yeah, the narrative shifts from competition to mutual survival. Expatriates are highly valued for maintaining essential services, keeping the power grids running and the hospitals staffed. Meanwhile, the citizens take on the ultimate burden of national security.
They form neighborhood watch groups, volunteer for civil defense, join cyber auxiliaries.
Exactly. And when expats inevitably have to leave the region because of the physical danger, the cultural nudges ensure this isn't framed as cowardice or abandonment by the foreigners.
Right.
Instead, the citizens' permanence, the fact that they cannot and will not leave their homeland, is framed as a profound point of national pride.
Which completely short-circuits the toxic out-group hostility that usually flares up during national crises.
It strengthens the in-group commitment without needing to demonize the out-group. It is really a masterful application of social identity theory under pressure.
So what does this all mean? It means the very crisis that threatens to destroy their comfortable state-sponsored lifestyle is the exact crucible needed to forge a highly resilient, self-reliant population.
It flips the passive rentier script entirely on its head.
It accelerates a maturation of the social contract that might have otherwise taken generations of slow, politically painful economic reform to achieve. The shock achieves what policy alone could not.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to you listening to this deep dive. We've talked extensively about national economies, neurobiology, and geopolitics. But the behavioral mechanics here are entirely universal.
They apply to everyone.
They really do. Think about your own life or your own organization. When your comfortable endowments, your established routines, your budget, your secure position in a company, when those are threatened by a sudden massive crisis, what does your brain do?
Right. Do you let the striatum take over? Do you freeze and hoard your resources?
Or do you find a broader identity, a shared purpose with your team or community to tap into? How could you proactively use constructive loss aversion to motivate yourself or your team to take action instead of letting fear paralyze you?
Those are the vital practical applications. But I want to leave you with a final, broader question inspired by Buheji's research.
Let's hear it.
Let's assume these nudges work perfectly. Let's say this intense wartime pressure successfully and permanently shatters the old rentier bargain. A population of previously passive consumers is transformed into a highly active, mobilized, and self-reliant citizenry. They've built their own neighborhood watches, they've rationed their own food supplies, and they've taken direct ownership of their national survival.
Okay.
What happens when the war ends?
Oh, wow. Well, if we look at historical precedents, like the profound shifts in the social contracts of European nations following the Second World War, populations that bleed for their country rarely accept the old status quo.
Exactly. Will a newly empowered, actively contributing population willingly return to a state of political quiescence?
It's hard to imagine.
Right. Will they simply go back to accepting bread and circuses in exchange for remaining silent on how their country is run? Or will this enforced behavioral shift permanently rewrite the social and political contract of the entire region? It is something really profound for you to mull over.
Because once you replace the insulated, padded walls of a fortress with the active, calloused hands of the people who actually built and defended it, well, society can't easily go back to the way it was. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden behavioral mechanics of crisis and resilience. We'll catch you next time.